recording. Welcome everybody officially to today's online event, Sexual Assault on College Campuses. This event is sponsored by the National Institute of Justice and the Government Innovators Network. I'd like to turn things over to today's event moderator, Marnie Shields, who is an attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. Ms. Shields.
Hi, and welcome to our event today. I'm very excited about the panel that we have today because I think the first two speakers are really going to help you understand better the nature of sexual assault on college campuses, and the third speaker is going to help answer the question of, okay, then what can we do about it? So I'm hoping that you'll all walk away from this really feeling like you have some knowledge that you can right away start applying on your campuses to address this problem. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of information about our office for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and about one of our grant programs in particular before we move on to our panel. We primarily administer grant programs. This is the Office on Violence Against Women, and we also sort of help develop policy for the government, for the department on violence against women issues. We administer currently one formula grant program, meaning it's a block grant to states based on their population, and 11 discretionary grant programs. We have some additional new grant programs that will be coming soon. We got funding for them in fiscal year 2008, but have not been able to develop the programs yet. So some new programs will be coming soon. We do have one program that specifically focuses on violence against women on college campuses, and I have our website on the slide. If you'd like to go to our website, we have little synopses of all of our grant programs, as well as our application kits show up on our website when they get posted. You can look at applications from past years. For example, our campus application is not posted yet, but you can look at last year's application if you want to get at least some idea of what the requirements are and what the program looks like. Some things change from year to year, so it won't be exactly the same, but a lot of it will be similar at least. So I'll move on to tell you specifically about the campus grant program since it's very pertinent to this topic. Eligible applicants for the program are institutions of higher education. We fund all different types of higher education, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, historically black colleges, tribal colleges, private colleges, public colleges, you name it. We have a very wide range. Grantees are required to do 4 things as part of the program. They have to implement a coordinated community response, and what that means is that they have to partner with both entities on campus and entities off campus to help develop their response to violent crimes against women on campus. External partners include things like the local police department and sometimes local courts, local victim services providers, local civil legal providers, and internal partners could be things like the student affairs department, judicial affairs, athletics, women's studies, student health, sort of anybody within the campus that might be involved in responding to violent crimes against women on the campus. They are also required to provide prevention education to all incoming students, and that includes things like transfer students, not just talking about sort of the traditional first-year student. And they have to provide training for campus law enforcement and campus judicial boards. The eligible purposes for this program include things like providing victim services on the campus, training for the different people like law enforcement and judicial boards and other entities on campus, developing policies and protocols for responding to violence against women on campus. There's actually a long list of purpose areas. If you look at our website, you can see the full list. And if you have any questions about our office or about the campus program or other programs, I'm happy to answer those later. But at this point, I'll let you move on to the better meat of this program.
Marnie, are you still there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Were you going to?
Oh, do you want me to upload the next set of slides, or are you going to do that?
Oh no, I'll do it. I was just waiting for your cue, whoever you were going to call on first to speak. And I'll call up the slides.
Okay, I can do that. Our next presenter is Dr. Christopher Krebs, and he is a professor at, I'm sorry, not a professor. He's a researcher at RTI International in the Crime, Violence, and Justice Research Program, and he's going to talk about a very exciting study that he has done on a college campus to better understand, I think, generally the nature of sexual assault on the campus, and specifically drug-facilitated sexual assault.
Thank you, Marty. I'm going to talk to you today about a study we conducted on behalf of the National Institute of Justice a couple years ago. They supported the work with a grant. We call the project the Campus Sexual Assault Study. I want to acknowledge Christine Lindquist, Tara Warner, Sandy Martin, and Bonnie Fisher, who are all very active collaborators in this project. We conducted the CSA study, as I said, a couple years ago, and its purpose was to generate data on the prevalence, context, and reporting of different types of sexual assault. And by types of sexual assault, we mean the different types of tactics used by perpetrators. And when we get into the prevalence estimates, you'll see a little more about what I mean by that. We conducted the survey using web-based methods. We recruited students at 2 large public universities via email. And we ultimately received completed surveys from 5,446 women. The response rate to get that number of women was about 42.8%, which, depending on the method you use or what field you come from, isn't great. It's about as much as you can hope for with a web-based survey. But I do want to mention that we did non-response bias analyses as well as a survey of non-respondents, and nothing we learned via those 2 methods gave us any indication that the sample we ended up with was really biased in any way. We also weighted the data to adjust for any differences we did find between respondents and non-respondents, so all data you'll be seeing today have been weighted. We collected a lot of data on a lot of different things, but I'm going to try to keep it short and hit the high points. So one of the things we wanted to do was identify the different types of sexual assault, and this is nothing new. Many other researchers have done this. But as Marnie said, one of the perhaps unique things about our study was its intent to get at this concept of drug-facilitated sexual assault, which is when a victim has been given a drug without their knowledge or consent that incapacitates them in some way and makes them unable to even provide consent, and then they're subsequently sexually assaulted. And although we all know about that and have heard about that, there weren't a lot of research studies out there that produced sort of prevalence estimates of that phenomenon. So what we did is, once we designed our survey instrument such that we would be able to divide our sample down into different victims of different types of sexual assault. And of course we have a rolled up category of any sexual assault, but then that divides down into physically forced sexual assault and incapacitated sexual assault. And incapacitated is, physically forced is exactly what it sounds like, but incapacitated is when someone experiences sexual contact when they were, again, incapacitated, asleep, unable to provide consent. And then within that incapacitated category, we have 3 more specific categories, which we call AOD-enabled or alcohol or other drug-enabled sexual assault, and that's when the victim is assaulted after having voluntarily consumed alcohol or drugs. We've got the drug-facilitated category, which again is when they've been given a drug without their knowledge or consent that incapacitates them. And then we have this kind of leftover category that we call otherwise enabled. And we did have some respondents, I believe it was about 50, who didn't fall into the AOD enabled or the drug facilitated, but did report being sexually assaulted when they were incapacitated. And in most cases, this was a situation in which the person was just asleep and they woke up and they were being violated in some way. So I want to present to you prevalence estimates for each of these boxes. One thing I want to say is that we included all years of study in our sample, so these are freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And what I'm going to be presenting are prevalence estimates for completed sexual assault. We also have data on attempted sexual assault, but those aren't presented or included in these estimates. So the prevalence estimates we came up with, and these reflect since the beginning of college. For any sexual assault, 14% of women indicated they were a victim of completed sexual assault of any type since entering college. Then that breaks down into physically forced and incapacitated. Those two boxes, the 5%, and I'll use the fancy little laser pointer here, the 5% and the 11%, those don't add up to 14% simply because women could be victim of both, physically forced and incapacitated, and certainly we had some who were. And then within incapacitated sexual assault, we see that those victims break down into the large majority of them being victims of AOD-enabled sexual assault, only 31 respondents reporting that they were victims or believed they were victims of drug-facilitated sexual assault, and then there's the otherwise catch-all category that comes in at about 1%. I mentioned that all years of study are represented in our data just because sometimes people look at these estimates and think they seem low, but the reality is when you subset to seniors who have had obviously a longer time to be sexually assaulted, this 14% number goes above 20%. So if you take seniors as an indication of one's college career, our data are suggesting that just over 20% of women experience some form of completed sexual assault during their college career. We also have past 12-month estimates that I'm not going to present to you, but I do want to at least mention that freshmen and sophomores have the highest past 12-month measures, and consistent with other research, that's just confirming that women are most likely to be sexually assaulted in their freshman and sophomore years, but that their overall prevalence just goes up over time, which is not at all surprising. I also want to talk about some factors that seem to be associated with experiencing sexual assault. I'm not going to call these risk factors because our study was cross-sectional. We collected all our data at one point in time, so we can't say that some of these factors preceded the sexual victimization. I'm also hesitant to use the word risk factor or term risk factor because it sometimes implies that perhaps the victim was in some way responsible because they presented some sort of risk, when that's not at all what we believe to be the case. But at least want to talk about some of the factors that do seem to be associated with experiencing sexual assault. And one of the things we felt compelled to do was look at these factors by different types of sexual assault. And some of these factors were consistent across different types and some were specific to type. But some of the things we found were that the number of sexual partners, consensual sexual partners, increased the likelihood of experiencing forced sexual assault, whereas fraternity party attendance frequency and substance use frequency were associated with the likelihood of experiencing incapacitated sexual assault. Two factors that were consistent with experience or associated with experiencing both forced and incapacitated sexual assault were experiencing intimate partner violence. Victims of intimate partner violence were much more likely to experience both forced and incapacitated sexual assault. And not surprisingly, having been previously victimized, sexually victimized, was associated with experiencing both types of sexual assault. But one thing that's interesting there is that there's actually specificity within type. So if you were physically forced to have to experience sexual assault before coming to college, you are more likely to experience physically forced sexual assault during college, but no more likely to experience incapacitated sexual assault during college. Conversely, if you experience incapacitated sexual assault before college, you are much more likely to experience that same type of sexual assault again during college. So not only do we find the re-victimization that so many other researchers have found, but we find specificity within type. So lastly, we also have a lot of data on the reporting of sexual assault and injuries and why people didn't report and to whom they reported. But I want to go ahead and just jump to some of the major takeaway messages from our study. First of all, we were very pleased with how the web-based methodology performed. It was incredibly efficient. We collected a lot of data in a very short period of time for not a lot of money. And as far as we can tell, the data quality that we have is something that makes us pretty happy, and the participating universities very happy. That continuity between prior and subsequent types of sexual assault we think is interesting and has prevention implications. The fact that risk factors or factors associated with being victimized can vary by type, we think is a contribution. The relatively low prevalence of drug-facilitated sexual assault is something that has surprised some people, but something that people have at least appreciated in the field, because prior to this study we couldn't find a lot of data on that phenomenon. The prevalence of reporting sexual assault continues to be obviously very low. It's barely in the double digits for reporting to service providers in terms of percentage of victims who report, and it's in the single digits for law enforcement, and that certainly remains to be an area where we need work. The role that alcohol plays in facilitating sexual assault is truly overwhelming in other studies as well as ours. And one of the primary purposes of or hopes of ours is that we can inform prevention messages going forward, and it's certainly our belief that any prevention message needs to include discussions about alcohol and excessive alcohol use. And given that freshmen and sophomores have much higher risk, we believe that the prevention messages, although they should happen throughout the college career, should be concentrated on the front end. And then lastly, I'll just say that we produced university-specific reports for each school, so they had a very good picture of what was going on their campus. We also have a final report that can be downloaded from the internet. Our hope is that all this information can inform the design and implementation of prevention programming that's effective. And lastly, I'll just say that we are currently in the process of replicating this study at 4 historically black colleges and universities, and we're in the field with that project now and hope to be working with additional universities going forward. And I'll close with my contact information should people be interested. Thank you.
Thank you. I think most of the questions I'm going to save for the end, but there was one question that a number of people asked, more or less the same question, which would be if you can address how you define sexual assault. What did you mean by completed sexual assault versus attempted sexual assault? Were you only including penetration versus other types of sexual assaults?
All very good questions, and I'll try to go through them briefly just because I know we have other presenters and I know there's probably a whole lot of questions. In terms of how we define sexual assault, we certainly looked at every other survey that had been used, the Sexual Experiences Survey and the survey that was used for the National Violence Against Women Survey, and we borrowed elements from all of those that came before us. But we certainly used behaviorally specific questions to started out by essentially defining sexual contact and defining unwanted sexual contact, and then had behaviorally specific questions to find out exactly what sorts of sexual contact, unwanted sexual contact occurred, and what tactics were used by the person making that sexual contact. In terms of completed, we had separate questions for incidents that actually ended up involving sexual contact, and incidents where sexual contact was attempted but where the person trying to make that contact was unsuccessful. So that allowed us to essentially create a dividing line between completed incidents and attempted incidents. And many victims certainly experienced both. And then lastly, the data I presented to you today presents generally on sexual assault. So that includes sexual contact that can be rape and penetrative, but it also includes touching or fondling, things of that nature. We are able to subset to rape, to penetrative acts, to some of the more serious stuff. But the data presented to you today, and that lowers the numbers certainly a little bit, although surprisingly not as much as you'd think. But the data today included force, touching, fondling, things of that nature.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and introduce the next presenter, Dr. David Lisak. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he's going to be talking about some research that he's done on the undetected rapists, which are those who rape but sort of stay under the radar. So, Dr. Lisak?
Thanks very much, Marnie. And thanks very much, Chris. It was really fascinating. I can't wait to see the article. I'm going to also move pretty quickly and stick to some very major points on offenders of really the other side of the coin of what Chris was just talking about, who are the individuals who are mostly responsible for these kinds of assaults. And just by way of background, I want to first address sort of the ongoing problem that we all have working in this area, which is dealing in a world of myths and stereotypes and unfortunately very little reality. I think we have two now very, very prominent myths about offenders, and both of them true myths in that they exist, but they don't exist in anywhere the kind of prominence that people believe. And so the first one on the right, the guy in the ski mask, the traditional stranger rapist that everybody really associates with the word rape, and it's still a very, very prominent myth in our communities and on our college campuses as well. And by and large, when people hear the word rape or they hear the word rapist especially, this is really the individual they picture in their minds, and the characteristics of the assault, too, that go along with that image of a traditional stranger assault. And of course, these kinds of assaults do occur, but they are a really quite small minority of sexual assaults. The other stereotype that has really emerged in the last, 20, 25 years or so is this the so-called date rapist and this whole term of date rape. And here the myth is that this guy is basically a nice guy, and I put that in quotes because when we do jury research, that's exactly what we hear all the time is jurors say, if it was a so-called date rape case, that well, he was basically a nice guy. He drank too much, she drank too much. They didn't communicate clearly about what their intentions were. What happened was kind of an unfortunate experience, dictated by the situation and circumstances. It was not premeditated. Of course, it wouldn't happen again. And this is the kind of thing that not only do juries sort of bring that into the courtroom and face this, but on college campuses, I've worked a fair amount with judicial boards, and when they are handed a case that they see as a kind of a he said, she said case, that they too are sort of, lots of times caught up in this mythology that this is who these offenders are. And I'm not saying that there aren't individuals out there who commit an assault where these kinds of characteristics are applied, but the data, which I'll just show very quickly in a moment, there's increasing amounts of data that make it very clear that the majority of assaults are not perpetrated by individuals like that or in circumstances that conform to that myth and stereotype, that they're actually quite different. And so just to summarize a little bit what we know about non-stranger rapists on the basis of studying these guys for the last 20 years or so. we know, for example, that weapons, although they're very much part of the popular stereotype and mythology about rape, weapons are almost never used. And not only are they almost never used in non-stranger attacks, they're almost never used in stranger assaults either. It's just part of our sort of collective mythology about rape. And then, very much related to that, the kind of violence that is used typically in a rape is really quite minimal. Obviously, not from the perspective of the victim, but in terms of overt violence, it's often really quite minimal. It's instrumental, meaning goal-directed, rather than gratuitous violence. There are certain perpetrators who are more likely to be gratuitously violent, but again, thankfully, those are actually very rare. And one of the things about goal-directed or instrumental violence is that since the goal is to intimidate the victim into submission, it actually takes far less overt force than most people think to intimidate somebody that way, especially, of course, tagging on to what Chris was just talking about, when that individual is, for example, extremely intoxicated or possibly drugged in addition to intoxicated. It doesn't take a lot to get them so frightened and so intimidated into a state of essentially frozen fright. So the level of violence is overt violence is very, very slight, and in fact the typical application of force might be literally an arm across a chest or neck, or a hand around the throat very briefly, or just pushing a person down, just using body or body weight. That in combination sometimes with threatening words, threatening gestures, it's quite minimal, and that of course contributes to what we typically or very, very frequently see in victims who, again, coming out of these kinds of experiences where they may well have been very intoxicated, they don't remember, sort of large amounts of overt force and violence. They too may have this idea that a rape is something that occurs when there's a lot of violence, and there wasn't a lot, and so it contributes to their confusion about how to label the event that they just experienced. So the other thing that is very, very clear from interviewing and studying these perpetrators is that these assaults tend to be well planned and premeditated, and there are just numerous examples from my own research, from other people's research, and just from cases that do come out into public view of the extensive amount of planning and premeditating that is going on. And it really completely belies or undercuts this idea that these are sort of spontaneous events that happen as a result of circumstance. And the other thing is that these, I'll show you in a minute some data on the recidivist nature of these perpetrators. They tend to repeat these offenses. And not only do they repeat them, they tend to commit a lot of different kinds of interpersonal crimes, and they use a lot of different strategies. And if you track them over time, or if you interview them about their entire history of interpersonal crime, you'll see sort of all kinds of different strategies used on all kinds of different victims in all kinds of different circumstances, with the only real common denominator being that what they demonstrate is a fairly predatory disposition towards other people, and a kind of an ability to tune into vulnerability, to detect vulnerability, and to exploit it, and to maximize it. And again, and it segues right into that alcohol issue, that alcohol is absolutely sort of just all over the place when you study sexual assault, and there's no question that as a risk factor from the standpoint of victims, that the use of alcohol, especially the extensive use of alcohol, and then using alcohol in certain types of settings clearly increases the risk of individuals. But I also think it's important to recognize alcohol as essentially the most common weapon used by assailants. So they, not surprisingly, go to bars and parties, and on college campuses, obviously the venues are fraternity parties and other places where college students go to drink. When you do this research in the community, you find that predators will go to parties or other social gatherings where there's alcohol being used, and it's because it's the perfect place for a predator to go, because your potential victims, you've got this room full of potential victims, and they're already voluntarily getting themselves intoxicated to some degree. So all you have to do is either exploit that level of intoxication or amplify it, maximize it, buy them drinks or so forth. And in some cases, of course, you can add something to a drink to increase the intoxicant effect. So I just want to then focus quickly on a study we did here in the Boston area a number of years ago, assessing 1,882 men. And in that group, we had 120 rapists, and I don't want to spend a great deal of time on methodology, but basically, if you imagine the methodology, the kinds of questions that Chris just talked about in assessing victimization, we use exactly the same kind of methodology except assessing perpetration. So never using words like rape or assault or abuse or anything like that, but describing in very, very graphic terms those kinds of behaviors. Of those 120 rapists, 63% were serial offenders. And I want to just show you a sort of basic pie chart of the sample. And I think the first thing I want to point out is I'll use this fancy laser printer here, is the large, vast majority of men in the sample, 1,762 out of 1,882 men, who were not rapists. And this, I think, has all kinds of implications for prevention work, since it's these men fundamentally who we need to be reaching out to and engaging and mobilizing in all of our efforts to prevent sexual violence. The next thing I want to talk briefly about is this small group of 44 men who acknowledged committing a single rape that was not repeated. We don't know a great deal about these men, other than it's mostly sort of what I can say about them is mostly in the negative, that they don't seem to share some of the things that we are discovering about this other group of men, the 76 serial rapists, in that the single act rapists do not seem to have the same kinds of backgrounds of increased levels of child abuse, do not seem to have the background of violence perpetrated already in adolescence, sort of continuing on into college years. So these men, I think, would be a hypothesis, would be these are more likely to be the men who are committing assaults that are more, to some degree, circumstantially and situationally determined. The 76 serial rapists in the study, as you can see, were responsible for an enormous number of rapes. And these are, by the way, the vast majority of these were completed rapes. There were only a handful of attempted rapes. And what is, I think, also important to recognize from this pie chart is, if you think of this as a snapshot of this type of crime in a community, although the numbers, 44 versus 76 is not that discrepant, the number of actual rapes committed is wildly discrepant. And in fact, that more than 90% of the rapes committed in this community were committed by serial rapists. And I think that has all kinds of implications, certainly for prevention, but also for law enforcement. Just to give you a sense of who these serial rapists are, we assessed not only rape and sexual assault, but also physical abuse of children, sexual abuse of children, and battery of intimate. This is domestic violence, essentially. And you can see the long list of crimes committed by these rapists, a total of over 1,000 offenses. And I guess I just want to harken back to that myth about date rapists, that the so-called date rapist is not a serious offender and it's not premeditated and it won't happen again. And it's quite clear that the majority of assaults are committed by individuals who are repeat offenders or serial offenders, and they are, like we find in any other criminological study or context, they're not just violent in one way. They have a long history of this, and there's more and more research coming out on this, not only in community criminological studies, but more and more studies looking at college populations, whether it's dating violence or sexual violence, that we're seeing this kind of same pattern of a history of assaultive behavior that starts pre-college, extends into college, and it is not only focused on, for example, either dating violence or sexual assault, but often crossing over those categories. So the last thing, and Jim, if I'm over time, just speak up and I'll shut up. I'll just very quickly outline what I think are some very, very just general implications for prevention. And the major one is that I think the core, what I'm labeling here in the center of the slide, the core sex offenders, who are these serial offenders, who are statistically responsible for the vast majority of sexual violence in a community, whether it's a college campus or a city. These individuals are not going to be prevented from committing these acts by any kind of public education programs. These are really true sex offenders, and we have a fair amount of sort of history of trying to work with sex offenders and trying to treat sex offenders. And even if you have these guys incarcerated for a number of years and in intensive treatment programs, you have only limited impact on their behavior. So it's quite clear that traditional kind of prevention education programming isn't going to reach these guys. They have to be isolated from the community. But the key thing is that these individuals don't, they aren't in hiding, and they don't act just as individuals. They're surrounded by people on campus. They're part of subcultures and cultures on campuses, like some fraternities, where there are individuals who may not be assaultive themselves or rapists themselves, but they certainly contribute very actively to that culture. And these are the individuals who need to be reached, as well as individuals like bystanders who are less directly involved in those subcultures, but still, they go to parties, they hear about things, they see things, and these are the people who have to be motivated and mobilized and educated to become very, very active participants in prevention. And the last point I'll make is that when I talk about sort of mobilizing towards prevention efforts, it's not just, sometimes we talk about, mobilizing people to be motivated, for example, to if they see somebody at a party who is essentially being groomed, who's very intoxicated, who's being led away, led upstairs or something like that, very clear that something bad might be happening, and we want people to feel like they have the authority and also the wherewithal and the training to step in and prevent something from happening. And certainly that is the case. It's sort of the equivalent of mobilizing people to intervene when somebody is about to take out their car keys when they are too intoxicated to drive. But prevention also works at a much, much larger level. That sexual violence occurs within the context of sexual degradation and the sort of isolation and degradation, the tolerance for degradation of a certain group. And if we're talking about, we could be talking here about sexual orientation, we could talk about gender and sex and so forth. But whatever that group is, when a society or a community tolerates degrading jokes, things like that, directed at that group, it creates an environment in which harassment and assault and other serious offenses towards that group become much more likely. And that's the level I think that the bystander education also has to address, so that people feel mobilized to address sexual violence right at that sort of foundational level. And I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much. I think one thing that was interesting is kind of the trend we have on alcohol use and sexual assault, and both of these presenters have talked about that. I think it's also interesting that you talked about mobilizing the non-rapists, because that leads very logically into our next speaker, Dr. Dorothy Edwards, who is the director of the Violence Intervention and Prevention Center at the University of Kentucky. And she has implemented and evaluated a prevention program called the Green Dot Initiative that is based on a bystander education philosophy. So, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you very much. Let's see, 7 minutes. I've never done anything in 7 minutes in my life, so here we go. I think it's imperative, regardless of what prevention strategy you go with or what direction you go in. Two things that have got to become standard. Number one is we've got to quit doing what doesn't work. And we have I think a long history of we start something, and once you kind of start something, it rapidly becomes, well, that's always the way we've done it. That's just the thing to do. And we've got the stakes are too high, and the cost is too high. And I think we've got to, even if we don't know exactly what direction we're going to end up going in, we've got to stop doing what we know doesn't work. The second thing is, as we stop doing that and begin to go in a different direction, make some different attempts in our prevention efforts, we can't just wing it. We've got researchers like David and Chris and a whole wealth of research from other fields that can inform us. So at least, even though there is not yet a certain path in terms of prevention of violence against women, we can certainly make some informed guesses. And then as the research begins to accumulate and our prevention strategies, refine until we get to where we're going. So with that as a foundation, as I began to work at University of Kentucky, I came in pretty sure that I had spent most of my career doing really good work, and by good work I mean well received and positive feedback and good numbers, like lots of people would show up to stuff and say that was really great. But I don't know how effective my work was when my ultimate measure was I want to reduce the number of people who become victims of violence. My work wasn't effective. So I came in real clear with I am going to do one of two things. I'm either going to figure out how to systematically and measurably reduce violence on a college campus, or I'm going to make a new set of mistakes. So at least we could check off, okay, that didn't work, and move closer. So as I kind of set out, I began in the research and began to read on everything I could get my hands on. And I wanted to touch really quickly on 4 bodies that I looked at. Started obviously in our own field. And what you will find is there is not yet a prescription. There's not yet a this is how this gets done. What there is, however, that is rich in its own right is quite a bit of information about what has not been working. And unfortunately, as I went through that, I realized what has not been working was my basic toolkit, everything I've been doing, kind of the one-time only. May do awareness well, may increase some knowledge some, but in terms of changing behaviors to the degree that needs to happen, the one-time only presentations weren't doing what we needed them to do. And within those, the content that we have been using, I think, falls into one of two basic categories. We've either been doing a real heavy emphasis on risk reduction, basically, which is, we all know it, which is here's the 10 things, potential victims. So we kind of talked to all women as potential victims and said, don't do this and don't do this and do more of this and less of this and don't dress like this, etc. And bottom line is, number one, that hasn't worked. We've been doing that for decades now, and we have not seen numbers systematically come down. And number two, I think inadvertently, and I share the responsibility of this, I think inadvertently we may have perpetuated the notion of blame the victim by keeping the focus so much on the woman's responsibility. And that kind of list of do's and don'ts, the quick response then is for people to go, well, she was drinking. Well, she was... So no research to suggest that that is our comprehensive answer. I think the other approach, sometimes explicit, I think mainly implicit, has been approaching all men as if they are potential perpetrators, with messages like, no means no, and this is what consent means, and here's all the legal definitions. And implicit in that is, guys, unless we tell you this, you're all going to be out there raping and beating. And what we just heard from David is just from his research alone and the body that he is working within, there's some explanation as to why that approach may not be working. Because men, you're either talking to the majority of the audience that are going, you know what, I've never raped or assaulted anyone in my life. I never intend on it. Why do you keep coming at me with this message? Like, hello, I'm not the bad guy here. Again, perhaps inadvertently contributing to this gender divide. Or we're talking to a group of men who it's not a matter if they don't know that no means no. It's not a matter if they don't understand the law. They know exactly what they're doing. It's premeditated. They're doing it over and over and over and over. And us coming up there explaining it isn't going to change it. So with that message, we have to ask ourselves, who exactly are we talking to? Who are we trying to reach with that? So both the kind of the structure, the one time only, as well as the content. There is not some research out there saying this is the way to go in terms of prevention. We know things like the longer the program, the stronger the results in terms of impacting people. But mainly what we have seen thus far in the violence against women stuff is we can have some impact on knowledge, we can have some impact on attitudes, but there's not a lot out there in our traditional work that suggests we were altering behaviors in the way that we wanted to alter them. So I left that body of research kind of going to okay, we're not the only people that ever thought of wanting to stop something before, ever wanting to prevent something. So began to look at some other research and just poking around to see what I could find. You stumble on the bystander literature, and it is a gold mine. It's a gold mine for a couple of reasons. One is it's been around for a long, long time. Researchers have been asking the question as far back as to the Holocaust, saying, as a world stood by while millions of people were killed, researchers are saying, how is it that good people are standing by and doing nothing, even when this is going on? And there's another surge of research in the 1960s around the Kitty Genovese case, where a woman was, brutalized and ultimately murdered, and there were witnesses at various points in time, and again, no one responded. And a surge again in the 90s with a case out in England where two 10, 11-year-old boys abducted a 2-year-old, and again, over the course of an afternoon, brutalized with lots of witnesses. And researchers coming back to the same question over and over: how do good people stand by and do nothing? And the beauty of this being decades old is they have found those answers. There is a list, 10 to 15 of those answers. This is why not just those people, this is why all of us tend to not intervene when we see something that's potentially high risk. And what a goldmine as an educator, for me to know in advance why you're about to say no or not do what I'm going to ask you to do is a dream. So now we can build a curriculum around those obstacles. We can build the curriculum knowing in advance this is why you're going to say no, and allowing us then to build realistic solutions. The bystander literature is also promising in that quite recently we have folks within our field, Moynihan and Banyard up in New Hampshire. Jackson Katz obviously has been around for a long time with MVP doing bystander work. So we have some initial research saying this is showing some promise. So I'm looking at that stuff going, this is awesome. The problem with the bystander stuff is I have just kind of made my target population as an educator bystanders. And last time I checked, bystanders is everyone. And that is a lot of people. Everyone is a lot of people. So I'm going, well, wow. Just on my own campus, the thought of having to reach everyone seemed like a lot, let alone when you go my community, my state, my country. And so when I stumbled upon within the public health research, the social diffusion theory, that stuff, again, is so promising. I was looking at the work initially of Jeffrey Kelly. And the social diffusion theory is based on this notion of culture change doesn't just happen when we, like we're all going to wake up tomorrow and spontaneously everyone in Kentucky is going to decide this new brand of jeans is the new jeans to wear. It's not how it happens. How it happens, what social diffusion theory suggests, is how it happens is there's kind of a group of trendsetters, 10, 15% of any given population are the ones that kind of set out with a new value or a new trend or a new pair of jeans or and they kind of get the ball rolling, and the majority of the rest of us just kind of little sheep, and we go along and follow along. And so now I've gone from I've got to reach everybody to if I could get these leaders. Jeffrey Kelly coined the phrase, I believe it was him, popular opinion leader, these polls, popular opinion leader, these really socially influential, another term if you're familiar with the tipping point, the early adopters. If we can get these popular opinion leaders to adopt some of these new values around becoming active bystanders, getting in there and intervening, if we can get them to make it cool and popular, that's the most efficient way to get the whole culture, because the rest of us are then going to go, oh, that cool and popular person, they're doing it. That must be the thing to do. So in terms of, and the research in that area is incredibly promising. Jeffrey Kelly's initial work was around HIV/AIDS in early 80s, and we're trying to impact increased safe-sex behaviors around gay men, and had a lot of different targeted behaviors, lots of studies, but just a simple summary of, for example, trying to increase condom use. And so going into a community and identifying the most socially influential, these polls within the gay community, pulling them out and going, equipping them over a series of trainings, equipping them with this is the way to go back and endorse and role model this new value of, for example, wearing condoms. And then sending them back into the community. Didn't hold a psychoeducational presentation where everyone would come and listen to them do kind of this paraprofessional curriculum, but instead sent them back in the community where they actually have the most natural influence among their friends and had them endorsing these new ideas. And the results are incredible. So changes in 20, 25, 30, 33% in the desired direction. And this study in the last couple of decades has been replicated over and over, and cross-culturally they're replicating studies around the world as we speak. And so this work not only was promising in that it gave me a more manageable target population, but also because of the promise, the possibility of really harnessing social peer influence in a way that I don't think we have done as effectively in the past. So the final area that we looked at is, if I'm targeting these polls, and what I'm wanting them to do is intervene in high-risk situations. They've got to know what a high-risk situation looks like, and that's where we really just dove into the perpetrated data. And whether you're talking about partner violence or child sexual abuse, and now with sexual violence, work of David and Chris and others, we've got some good places to start. We can begin to cue people away from the victim's behavior and cue them to, this is what the earliest warning signs of perpetrator behavior, and these are the things to recognize and begin to intervene. So with that research kind of as the foundation, I developed this program called Green Dot, and at its most simple, it is simply the premise is violence against women is far-reaching enough that we require a culture change. And that means we've got to identify the behavior that we want changed, and we've got to get enough people, a critical mass of people, to engage in that new behavior. And that's this bystander intervention. That's what we're wanting them to do. But when you start talking culture change to people, people get a bit overwhelmed. I'm one person, I can't change the culture kind of thing. So the Green Dot campaign, the conceptualization is really at it's breaking down culture. It's really saying on any given campus or community, right now you're looking at the Green Dot, our whole state, violence isn't one single mass. It's not a phenomenon. It's not a statistic. Violence is one single moment at a time. The moment someone raises their hand to someone, the moment someone chooses to have sex. And it's moments of apathy. The moment someone chooses to walk away and say, that's none of my business. Each of these are represented by one red dot, one moment. And we don't know how many green dots are on the map, but we know there are enough to sustain numbers like 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 3. So the solution, we're arguing, is a reflection of the problem, which is it's got to be single moments. It's got to be one green dot is one moment in time where you choose to intervene. One green dot is one conversation you have with a friend or a colleague about this being important to you. And it's the notion of one green dot is one moment in time where someone chooses their actions, their behaviors, their choices to contribute to safety and to be visibly intolerant of violence. And the image, the conceptualization, number one, allows people to kind of see their place in the movement. It allows momentum and traction because I'm looking around going, you know, I'm doing a green dot and they're doing a green dot, and I see this picture of what we're trying to do. We're literally trying to outnumber and then displace the red dots. And it also breaks it down to manageable nuggets. Because again, you say change the culture, people get overwhelmed. When I say, can you give me one moment in time, one green dot, and here's what it can be, whether you're a student or administrator or a lawyer or the president, here's the single moment you can do. People can go, well, yeah, I guess I could do one moment. So that's the basic concept kind of built on that prior research, and I will stop there because I know we are at time.
Well, thank you so much. At this point, we'll move on to the question and answer part of this. A few people have submitted questions, but please feel free to submit further questions so that we can have some conversation. I think we have about an hour left, so it'd be great to have some interesting dialogue. I think the first question I'd like to pose is to Dr. Lisak, and the question is, in the cases of the rapists that you discussed, did any of them involve group or gang rape?
Yes, there's a minority. The majority of the rapes that I have studied through interviewing offenders are single actors, single rapists. But there's I haven't kept any data on the percentages, but certainly somewhere between 5-10% in that neighborhood were either two or more assailants. And there's also another sort of, I don't know what to call it, the rapes that where the almost like single act rapists who are working in such close concert with other individuals that it doesn't fit the sort of classic definition of a gang rape, but nor is it quite a single actor. So there's a kind of a, I don't know what to call it, a gray area or just an additional category of, sort of semi-gang rape.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Edwards. Can you talk a little bit more about what the specific campus intervention looks like on your campus?
Yep. It's a two-phase piece. Phase one is really the kind of basic education, introducing the image, introducing the red dot, green dot language, really in many ways reintroducing this issue, because again, this issue's got a whole lot of baggage, a whole lot of stigma already attached. People already got us categorized as, man haters this, or blame the victim this. I mean, there's so much stuff. So phase one is really coming in and having a brand new conversation that's gender neutral, that doesn't even go to a conversation about victim, and instead just is this introducing this idea of, you know what, on this campus, this violence is happening, and if everyone does their little piece, their little green dot, we can begin to shift this. So it's literally like a 45-minute persuasive speech, very little content. It's a persuasive speech that introduces the idea of green dot and the idea of everyone doing their little piece. And so that's phase one. And it's not just to students, it's to faculty and administrators. It's really been introducing that language. Phase two is then more targeted. Phase two is when we do and it's probably worth noting, we have some funding from Department of Education where we've been doing some evaluation. And it's worth noting that we have found, while literature has historically said a one-time only presentation can't be real effective in changing behavior. At the same time, just the practical realities, when they come to me and say, you can speak to every incoming freshman class for freshman for 50 minutes, it's hard for any of us educators to walk away from that and go, well, one-time only presentations don't work. So instead I asked myself, well, if I know they don't work doing this, telling, and this meaning the standard presentation, stats and legal definitions and male and female socialization and the law and resource, all of this stuff. If I know that doesn't work in changing behavior, what if I try something completely different? And my hypothesis is, what if I don't try to do any of that other stuff? What if all I try to do is persuade? What if all I try to do is get them to follow up in some way with a green dot? And our initial research is telling us that exposure to this green dot message, even one time, the one-time only presentation, is significantly increasing the likelihood they're engaging in both proactive and reactive bystander behavior. And there's a dosage effect. The more they were exposed to it, the stronger that. So phase one is introducing language. Phase two is a more targeted bystander training. It ranges from 6 hours to a couple of days. We're actually experimenting with length, and that is where we get students. Some of them we target as popular opinion leaders. They get invited specifically to it, and we also cast a wide net for people that are just interested. And that's a 5 or 6 hour training that does two primary things. It really gets really specific about what are red dots we want them to cue to. So we, in fact, use a lot of David's work and others and say, this is what it's going to look like, and then here are the green dots you can do, and we get really specific. The second piece of that training is talking in detail about all of the obstacles. Because it's one thing to sit in a room and say to a fraternity guy, hey, next time you see your frat brother taking the girl upstairs, you need to do something about it. And they're nodding, going, okay, I sure will. And they're thinking, lady, you have no idea the social cost of what you're asking. Like, you have no idea how I'll be ostracized. You have no idea. So we create a space where we have honest dialogue about what are the obstacles to doing this? What are the things that are going to get in your way that's going to keep it from doing it, even though you want to? And they fall in the category of peer pressure, like I just talked about, personal variables, like I'm too shy, I don't like conflict, as well as those broader bystander things that come from the literature. And we break down those obstacles, and then we develop solutions taking those into account. So, for example, if they say, I won't do this because I'll take too much crap from my fraternity brothers. And we make it safe to say, well, what could you do? What could you do given that you don't want to face that kind of pressure? And they have come up with the most innovative things, from just creating a distraction. Hey, dude, your car's getting towed. Like, a guy literally came in and said, I just did this one. And so we never did a direct confrontation of, you need to stop what you're doing because it's not okay, which is ideal. But in the moment, I just want that assault not to happen. So instead he goes, hey, your car's getting towed. The guy runs out. He's now got 2 or 3 minutes to get her friends and get her out of there. So they come up with some really innovative things once you make it safe to say, what are the obstacles? And so that's what that training then encompasses. And then we're experimenting with various forms of follow-up, because we know that, again, repeated exposures is going to increase the strength of the impact.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions now for Dr. Krebs that are sort of related. One is someone who wants the numbers for completed and or attempted rape, and I think they're also interested in other forms of sexual assault. And then the related question is, did you ask about coercion and threats as well as physical force and incapacitation?
Let me handle the second question first. We did. We have some of those sexual coercion-oriented items about when people told you lies and made promises and threatening to end relationships and spread rumors, and we modeled a lot of that after what some very smart researchers who came before us did. I'm afraid I don't have those numbers offhand, but certainly if they want to contact me, those are numbers that I can come up with or run. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the first question?
Yeah, they were looking for the numbers on rape, attempted rape, and sexual assault, attempted sexual assault. And
that's something that I'm going to have to pull up also, but it's something I can do fairly easily.
All right. This question is for everybody or whoever wants to take it, whether any of you are aware of any studies that have looked at pornography use in rape.
Well, I'm not sure if Chris, if you know some specifics. I know that in general, it's been very difficult to document very clearly specific impact of consumption of pornography. Off the top of my head, my recollection is that it has been associated with increased in sort of in calloused attitudes about women, calloused attitudes about sexuality. And I'm vaguely remembering a more recent study that gets actually even closer to, I guess, I can't remember whether it's just an association between actual sexually assaultive behaviors and use of pornography. I do know from my forensic practice, I do forensic work in criminal cases, and it is you almost never encounter a serial rapist who does not have a extensive history of pornography use, and in fact, where the pornography use is very much tied in through sort of a long history of sexual fantasies to the actual rapes that he commits. So it's certainly very compelling at that sort of right at the ground level of dealing with individuals who commit these crimes. It's been much harder to document very clearly quantitatively, but I think we're getting closer to that. Whether there's so many complexities in trying to document this kind of especially a causal effect that it's very difficult, but when you see it on the ground, it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, I'll just say I can't think of any specific studies offhand, but I know there have been some. Certainly there seems to be an association, and folks at CDC and others will talk about pornography use as a risk factor, but David's exactly right in that a lot of the research that's tried to draw those links has been cross-sectional, and it's hard to know if the pornography use is contributing to sexual aggression, or whether it's simply another symptom, meaning that the sexual aggression and the pornography use are both symptoms of something else that predispose an individual to be interested in either of those things.
Okay, question for Dr. Edwards. Is there any resources available for other campuses that would like to implement the Green Dot strategy?
Yeah, if following up with me would be the easiest thing to do. We're really experimenting. We're really concerned, as we're just now through some partnerships with faculty researchers and with money from DOJ as well as DOE, we're, really in evaluation, doing some serious evaluation. And since there aren't any proven strategies, it's not like I want to wait 10 years to go, okay, let's try this. I mean, we need to take our best guess. But I am really, at this point, everyone's kind of concerned about kind of the fidelity of the model. So we're really working on manualizing it and getting it to a place. But in the meantime, we just finished doing a training here in Kentucky where folks came in from around the country to get trained on phase 1, and we certainly consult around with universities, and we'll do whatever is best. We're again partnering however we can best to disseminate as rapidly as we can to anyone who thinks this particular lens might gain some traction where they're going. So the easiest way to kind of tailor that and answer that would be individually to kind of get in touch. And I don't think I put my contact information on there, but if you just go to the University of Kentucky's website and pop in my name, it'll pop up.
Okay, here's another question for the panel as a whole. What, if any, involvement of stalking behavior has been documented in connection with these campus sexual assaults? Have any of you seen a link between stalking and sexual assault?
Yes, there's again the research on stalking is it's a much more recent field of study, but it's very clear that it intersects entirely with both domestic violence or dating violence and sexual violence, and in fact, there's a real lesson, I think, for us all in for all kinds of reasons we tend to think about these domains as kind of separate domains, and we're here to talk about sexual violence today, sexual assault, We could be here talking about domestic violence or partner violence or dating violence, or we could be talking about stalking, and to some extent there are differences and divisions among those three categories of interpersonal violence, but there's an enormous amount of crossover, and so there's the beginnings of research now into exactly that. The crossover, the frequency at which individuals who are subjected to partner violence are stalked by those individuals, and also the intersection of stalking behavior with sexual assaults, and the intersection of all three. So there's it's very much the case that these are interrelated, and of course one of the practical implications of this emerging research is for public safety officials to be very, very aware of a report of, for example, of stalking needs to be looked at very, very carefully because of the potential for this to be either part of or to gravitate towards another form of violence.
And I'll just throw in FYI, the National Stalking Resource Center, just their website alone has just an incredible wealth of great information that speaks to that very question, and they're just an incredible resource.
And Marnie, I was going to just kind of dive back in with those numbers someone had requested. They were interested in attempted. So the prevalence of completed sexual assault in our sample was 14%. And the prevalence of attempted sexual assault was just under 13%. It was 12.6%. So, and obviously some were victims of both. When you combine attempted and completed, the prevalence is 19%. And then they were interested in the breakdown of rape. So the prevalence of physically forced sexual assault, which included everything, was 5%. But if you subset down to just physically forced rape, it's 3.4%, and then incapacitated rape, although it was 11% for all forms of sexual contact, for rape it's 8.5%. So the majority of our victims of sexual assault did encounter what would legally be defined as rape.
Great, thank you. My next couple related questions are for Dr. Edwards. The first is, how many people do you get for each of your 6-hour training sessions, and how did you get the students to commit to that time frame? And then the related question was, how do you motivate your leaders to participate in the program?
Okay, let me see. Our edits, the thumbnail sketches, when we started, we've done this, the bystander training as it currently stands. We were on our third complete cycle of it, and we started with 14 students, 13 women and 1 man, and this year we're about halfway through our cycle. We've done 1,400, about 40% of which were men, and it's all voluntary. We've never used mandatory because I don't think it's effective in this particular context. And how we did it is, I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to do one of those political maneuvers where I was going to answer whatever with my own answer, even though I didn't care what the question was, so you could just get it in like people do. But this really does relate. That we really have, the slide you're looking at right now, we really have a strong, there's good research on how you get people to do stuff. And there's these 5 basic components that are pulled from a variety of areas. They've got to know there's a problem. They've got to, number 1. Number 2, they've got to believe that they are a necessary part of the solution. Number 3, they have to know what to do. Number 4, they have to know how to do it. And number 5, it has to feel manageable. It has to feel doable. And so we have built this, what I call the butterfly model that you're looking at, it is the lens through which we do everything at our center. People need 2 things. This individual in the middle with the little green dot, that's the person we're trying to target. We want to get a bunch of these individual critical mass to shift our culture. And people need 2 things. They need competence and ownership. And one without the other, I think have historically done one without the other. Very often, ownership. We do some great, like, Take Back the Night rally, and everyone gets emotional and involved, and they hear compelling stories, and they say, okay, I want to do it. You got me hooked. And then we don't follow up with, well, what exactly do I do? And so the emotion fades, time goes by, and it never manifested how we needed it. The flip is true. We do competence sometimes without taking the time to build ownership, and how that usually manifests is through mandatory. Like I could have come in and said to the administration, I want to mandate that all the fraternities, all the freshmen, all the all the athletes have to sit through this training. And we've all the educators out there have sat through that. When you know they don't want you there, I could have done my 5-hour training by mandate. I could have given them a pre and post test that proved they had the competence, but if they never had that ownership, if they never said, yep, this is something I feel some responsibility for, it was never going to manifest in everything. So the left side of this butterfly is how we go about engaging, building those, and I won't go into detail, although it's tempting, is building those relationships, taking the time up front to be connected. It's kind of like making sure they're listening. It doesn't matter what you're saying if they're not listening. So building those relationships, once they're listening, getting them connected to the issue and that idea that they can make a difference. Once we've got them, once they're owning it, then building the knowledge base and the skill set. So philosophically, that's the lens through which we are engaging people. In terms of how that concretizes on the ground, we do 2 strategies. One is a real broad-based, a wide net, where all the incoming freshmen, we meet one way or another, and that green dot persuasive speech I told you about. We do our best persuasive speech, this matters and you can do your part, and then we end it with, if you do only one thing, consider coming to this training. The second thing we do, so it's a wide open invitation. The second thing we do is through a whole lot of different ways, we do personal invitation to popular opinion leaders. We take the time to build the relationships, and we've targeted that through really breaking it down into mainstream socially influential groups on campus. On our campus, student government's real influential. Greek life is huge, both sororities and fraternities. So it's nurturing those relationships. And also, identifying groups that are in fact least impacted by these mainstream groups, and identifying their pull. So whether it's faith-based groups or gay lesbian community or the African American fraternities, the Martin Luther King Center, so identifying, doing a real cross-section to make sure we're getting popular opinion leaders from all different groups. And we just take the time to build the relationships. Our first year, we had one student government person going, and that's because I kind of built a relationship with the president. He said, okay, I'll send someone. So he sent someone, and then just through their own word of mouth, this year we trained 1,000 Greek people that were there because they wanted to be. So taking the time to build that ownership and build those relationships, and it's just now snowballed. Now it's snowballing, and now it's becoming the norm. People kind of go, oh yeah, you're going to that, right? Like, of course, everyone goes to this training kind of thing.
Yeah, I can say our staff went to one of the trainings, and they brought back some green dots, and they said those green dots are really coveted.
Yes, they are indeed. Yes, I gave them some of the highly coveted lapel versions.
My next question is for Dr. Lisak. Actually, before I do that, someone wanted to know the website for the Stalking Resource Center that Dr. Edwards had mentioned. There's a couple of websites I can give you. The primary website for the Stalking Resource Center is www.ncvc, it's National Center for Victims of Crime.org, /S as in Sam RC for Stalking Resource Center. They've also just launched a website for Stalking Awareness Month, which is fantastic. It's got posters and sort of everything you would need to launch a Stalking Awareness Month campaign, and it's logically enough stalkingawarenessmonth.org. And now I'll move to the question I was going to ask, which is for Dr. Lisak, and the question was how you got the pool for your survey.
I've done studies like this for many years, and the typical sort of scenario is we start off by using a questionnaire survey. When I've done this research at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, we will get somewhere between 15 and 20% of the male student body, and they answer a whole bunch of questions about sexual behaviors and oftentimes other things depending on what we are looking at. And many of those questions then include very, very specific graphic questions about sexual behaviors, including sexual assault and rape and so forth. And then we bring in, we offer we offer some money basically for individuals to come in for screening interviews. And so we will screen both control subjects and also individuals who've indicated that they've committed sexual assaults or rapes. And we actually do wide open interviews with them, and including autobiographical interviews, and we get details about the assaults that they committed, because we want to make sure that even though these surveys are very, very explicit and graphic, we want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding and that they actually have committed assaults that meet the legal definition of rape. And so that's been the process. I did that research at Duke, did it now at UMass. Similar kind of format has been used by any number of, well, I shouldn't say any number, a number of other researchers, including Antonio Abbey has been doing this now in both at I think it's Wayne State University and also in the Detroit area in the community. And other people have done it on college campuses, both in the United States and around the world.
Okay, I got another question for Dr. Edwards, which is, can you share how the numbers of reported sexual assault incidences on your campus have changed since the implementation of the Green Dot Project?
Well, we are at, again, with it being as relatively new as it is, the good news is, what we do know is reports to the police have gone up significantly. We have a center on campus called the Center for Research on Violence Against Women that gave us some baseline data before, like the month or two before our center started. We had baseline data similar to Chris's that gave us a real detailed look on what perpetration and victimization look like on our campus. And what we saw, and that's going to be replicated again in 2010, and we're hoping at that point to see some positive movement in the numbers. What we have seen is a change in the reporting to the police. Those numbers have actually gone up. We went from 2.5% of victims of rape reporting to the police, which is about half the national average, to more than 9%, so almost double the national average. So we have indications that we have done enough of a cultural shift that it is becoming safer for people to give voice to their experience. We are going to know, and again, we also have data suggesting we are very much just kind of similar to Banyard and Moynihan's work, that we are seeing an increase in bystander behaviors. We are looking to spring 2010 to see, is the increase in those bystander behaviors, are they reaching a point where, as a result, we're seeing a reduction in perpetration? And I don't have the answer yet.
Great. Another question. Is there any type of survey that you could administer to incoming freshmen to sort of understand what you're dealing with, whether any of them are sex offenders or likely to become sex offenders, things like that?
No. I think that the only thing that we know sort of for sure is that individuals who have committed these kinds of assaults prior to coming into college, university, are at much greater risk for committing them while they're at universities. The problem is that even that is far from a one-to-one correspondence or relationship. So you can readily imagine what kind of problems you'd have ever trying to apply that kind of a screening tool. And then all the other things that, there's plenty of data on attitudes and levels of anger and feelings of anger towards women, feelings of dominance and need to control women. All kinds of things have been measured, and it's quite clear that rapists score higher on those kinds of measures than non-rapists do. But it's nowhere near, sort of at a level that would be useful in terms of a screening instrument. It would just get you into all kinds of legal difficulties. So the unfortunate answer, and the reason I laughed is that, of course, I've been working with the U.S. military on this for the last number of years, and that was the first thing that the generals wanted was, well, let's just develop a screening tool. We'll just keep these guys out of the military and our problem solved.
Okay, another question for Dr. Edwards. The kind of prevailing thinking is that bystander education should be delivered by men to men, and your approach doesn't seem to have that gendered focus. And perhaps that would make this more sustainable. And so just do you have any reaction to that?
I do. I know there's the research on the gender stuff is mixed in that there are some contexts and some topics that the gender divide is important, and we have gender-specific stuff. We've got a men's programming coordinator that does some great gender-specific stuff around socialization, things like that, as well as some female-specific stuff that we do. But what I believe is, and again, what I believe is the gender divide has hurt us, crippled us in terms of getting the critical mass we need on board. And so we have our foot in the door, meaning kind of the face of VIP, and our initial programming is gender neutral. We use gender neutral language. When this place was first founded, it was called Women's Place. I didn't name it, and I changed it right away to Violence Intervention and Prevention Center. While I'll use the phrase violence against women in some contexts, the phrase we use around here is power-based personal violence, because again, we have been extraordinarily ineffective in engaging men in this work. And so we have been since we're not starting with a blank slate, since we're starting with a steep gender bias, and we know that we need men shoulder to shoulder. We know most men aren't perpetrators, and we know we need men shoulder to shoulder. We are being really proactive in gender neutralizing. And so our initial programming is very deliberately and intentionally gender neutral. We go into a room and we talk about this kind of violence, and we talk about everyone's role, men and women. Now, when they come to the actual training and they begin to personally identify obstacles and things like that, sometimes there's a gendered component. And so we have male facilitators as well as female facilitators that are there doing that work. And like I said, once folks are engaged, once they begin down this path with us, then we'll get to some of the more then we'll do gender-divided stuff. But no, right now our hypothesis, and again, we're doing the best, is to try to gender neutralize this a bit.
Marty, I wanted to chime in on something that I've been, as I mentioned, I've been working with the Air Force and now the Army on and they're really ramping up their efforts in this area of sexual violence prevention. And what's been very interesting is, it's such a completely different context in some ways. And one of the ways it's completely different is it's been very clear that the approach within the Air Force and within the Army is not going to be sort of from either a feminist perspective or from the perspective of this is a women's issue. So it's been from the beginning this is our community, and something bad's happening in our community, and we all have a responsibility to our community. So it is, as Dorothy was just describing, it has been from the beginning really completely gender neutral, and I think, and my sense has been much more palatable, and in fact, and beyond palatable. I think men are just much more responsive when it is, when it's framed in that way and taken out of the context of this bad things are happening to this particular group, and you should feel like you have a responsibility to those people. And so it's been very impressive to see it, sort of happening in a way, quite by, I guess, by accident. It's not deliberate that the military has taken it from that perspective. It's just, sort of the only way it was going to happen, I think. But it's been very instructive to see how it's been unfolding.
And we've seen a dramatic shift. I mean, when I first got here, it was called Women's Place. We got one guy to show up. Every once in a while, you'd get, a couple of guys to straggle in. And literally, we've gone up to, and some programs, the majority of people being men. Overall, our overall volunteer and bystander program, we're pushing right past 40% now. And we're talking of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of active volunteers or people that have gone through the training. And so there's something, again, while I don't have the science yet, we're in that process. Anecdotally, gender neutralizing has mobilized men on this campus in a way that, again, doing this work for 10, 15 years, I haven't been able to do before.
Kind of related to this theme we're on, what are the key behaviors of perpetrators that bystanders should be trained to intervene on? And I'd love to hear from all three of you on this one.
Dorothy, why don't you start with that one, since you are specifically training on it.
Okay, we do. It depends on the population, because theoretically, when I say, we want to recognize, we want bystanders to recognize risk for perpetration as early as possible. And when I say as early as possible, what I want is, as we begin to move into preschools and elementary schools, I want them to begin to recognize risk factors for young boys to become perpetrators. Identifying the risk and protective factors, identifying those bystanders that are best positioned to address the risk factors and to enhance the protective factors. So getting in the broader picture, I want it to go all the way back there. On a college campus, depending on the crime we're talking about, we use a lot of obviously the most immediate, there's kind of the stereotype of the most immediate, and we want a guy dragging a, drunk girl upstairs, or a guy, physically assaulting a woman right there in front of you kind of thing. And then we trace back to what if you're talking about physical assault or a partner abuse, we begin to look at that power and control stuff, some of that controlling and jealousy and those kinds of things, and what do those signs look like, and what are ways you could check in, what are ways you could quote-unquote intervene and reduce the likelihood that thing takes hold. With sexual violence, again, going back to the initial, for lack of a better word, grooming, how they're identifying incoming, freshmen. We use a little snippet of David's work where the young man, talks about, oh yeah, we identify and then we invite to the party. And so cueing people to, if a popular senior guy is inviting a freshman girl they never met to a party, even right then and there, if you're the girlfriend going, well, sure, and we're all going to go with you, kind of thing. So the earliest signs of, how they make those initial contacts, to the boundary testing that can happen. So what does that look like at a party when they're kind of pushing on the boundary some, to obviously alcohol is huge. So how do you discern the difference between, hey, can I buy you a drink, and pushing the alcohol kind of thing, and then up to isolating, beginning to isolate. I firmly believe perpetrators are testing the bystanders at least as much as they are testing the victims. Are they going to let me take their friend? Are they going to let me get away with this? And so we go through kind of that whole process, a lot of it based on David's published work. We also look at Stephen Thompson, who's got a profile that's, I don't believe been published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it's not inconsistent with David's work and others, and gives kind of a detailed look at some of those behaviors. So that's kind of an overview.
Well, it's certainly not my area, but I was just going to chime in and say that, what we're hearing so much of from colleges is the need to kind of address a lot of the things Dorothy was talking about, but that kind of form a culture on campus. And, to say on campus sounds kind of broad, because campuses are large and diverse, and certainly people live and move off campus as well. But the kind of culture that conveys sort of rape supportive attitudes, and it can be something that's perceived gender inequality or gender preferences that are going on. Certainly, I believe David was speaking about, it starts with jokes about what's appropriate and what's not, and how you coerce women or pressure women into doing certain things. And we have these on campus. We hear about them in different environments, sports teams, fraternities, clubs of virtually any kind, parties, and I think there's a real hope that the programs that are out there, whether it be Green Dot or Men Can Stop Rape or other programs that are being implemented and tested, is that you can hopefully over time really change the culture on a campus as a whole.
We also, if I could jump in with one more thing, we also break Green Dots into two different types, proactive and reactive. And while we use the perpetrator data to cue them to the reactive stuff, like if you see this is something you should react to, we also talk about the need to kind of be tightening the spigot upstream a little bit of what are things you could be proactively doing to make it a hostile environment for a perpetrator. And I ask the question, very often when someone, if someone comes to the University of Kentucky who's never heard of us before, how do they know that basketball matters and that they're supposed to bleed blue? And they have a real concrete answer to that. Well, everyone wears shirts and everyone goes to the games and everyone talks about the games before and after, and there's posters all over, and there's articles in the paper and all of these things. And I ask the same question. If either a potential perpetrator or a bystander, if just an incoming freshman comes through your peer group or your residence hall or your class, how will they know the expectations? How will they know what will and won't be tolerated around this issue, and the expectation that they will be proactive? And then we get real concrete. The answer is very similar. Are you having conversations? Are you wearing shirts? Are you wearing your Green Dot pin? Are you writing your papers? Are you bringing training to your organization? So really concretizing, even as we are addressing the high risk, how can we at a broader level be reducing the amount of high-risk situations that ever get to evolve?
Marty, I'll just add one thing that sort of links to both what Dorothy and Chris were just saying. I'm going to go to that slide again of that pyramid. One of the ways that this has really been in working with large groups of either Army or Air Force personnel, men, to get home the critical importance of beginning to see themselves as active members of the community who are responsible to the community, and to what Chris was describing as the culture of whether it's the Air Force or the Army or the college campus. And right at the bottom of that pyramid, when we're talking about degrading jokes, remarks made about certain groups, obviously about we're talking about women, one of the things that, and I view this really just as a tactic to get men to see this in a sort of different light, is that if you imagine a group of men standing together around and somebody makes a degrading comment or a joke about a woman who's walking by, and everybody laughs at it, and somebody, some of the people who laugh are a little uncomfortable, some of them laugh because they think it's funny or they're not thinking about it, and so forth. There's we're not arguing that making jokes like that is going to lead, otherwise law-abiding young men to become rapists. But it does create, obviously, a climate. And part of the way to make that concrete for people is to have them imagine what is the impact when that group of people all laugh at this degrading joke. What's the impact of that laughter on the one rapist who may be in that group? And how much it facilitates, it fosters, it helps him rationalize his behavior and so forth. It really, and sort of what Dorothy was just saying, it allows him to remain embedded in the culture rather than to stand out. And if you reverse that and you start imagining what happens if you have a shift in that culture where that kind of behavior, those attitudes, when they're spoken out loud through jokes and so forth, when they're met with silence, when they're met with remarks actually that, that's offensive and so forth, well, suddenly the individuals who really hold those attitudes start to stand out more, and you begin to isolate them. And there are, I don't want to sort of get off track into all kinds of benefits of that, but I think it's the degree to which this prevention work really does have to take on the culture of the community is really core. It was very instructive when I was working with the Air Force and the Army that they quickly saw this, and this was not by any means, as you can imagine, what they sort of were used to thinking about, but they quickly saw how much this work has to be directed at some of the most fundamental aspects of the culture.
Next question is a short question for Dr. Krebs. Were there any men against violence groups, to your knowledge, on the campuses where you conducted your surveys?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. This question, the next one, is primarily, I think, for Dr. Lisak, but the others can jump in. The question is whether there's a correlation between the severity of the sexual assault and the length of time that the offender has been planning the assault.
I'm certainly not aware of any data on that, and but I would not think so. Most of the planning and the premeditation around in non-stranger sexual assaults has to do with the vast majority of these assaults begin in some kind of public place. So the assailant goes to whether it's a fraternity party or to some other party or to a bar, and they go there because they're quite aware that that's where potential victims are going to be, and they're going to be drinking, and then they will look for potentially, sort of more vulnerable individuals, whether that's because, primarily that might be individuals who are more intoxicated than others and so forth. And then they'll start the grooming process, and Dorothy was just talking about some of the elements of that, of violating personal space or making sexually provocative comments and seeing whether they can get away with that. The main element, the main manipulation at some point has to go, how do you get this victim isolated? Because the assault's not likely to occur right there in a public place, and so that's where you get strategies like either there's a room somewhere. If it's a fraternity house, they may have rooms that have been set aside before the party that are going to be used, or the perpetrator will say, you're very intoxicated, you're very you're drunk, you shouldn't be driving. Let me drive you home, or I'll walk you back to your room. It's a manipulation that is very much geared toward getting this victim isolated somewhere where an assault could occur. And so that's what the planning and the premeditation is usually involved in. I don't think it has much to do, or whether there's much correlation between that and sort of any measure of severity. Because the other thing is a lot of these perpetrators, if their victim willingly goes along with the sexual activity, and of course at a certain level of intoxication it's kind of a moot point, but they're not, it's not like they are only going to have sex if they can rape somebody. If the person they target is willing and it's consensual, then that's fine with them. And if the person needs to be coerced to some degree, that's fine with them. And if the person needs to be assaulted and really forcibly forced, then it's fine with them. So the premeditation is really in the choice of the victim, the grooming of the victim, the isolation of the victim, and then the degree of force or coercion is really just determined by how much is necessary to overcome her resistance.
Okay, this next question is sort of related to Dr. Lisak's pyramid, although I think any of you can respond if you'd like. This question is about the larger context of violence against women, sort of the rape culture, that we can teach bystanders to be allies on the personal level, but what about going up against the culture, the things like movies, advertisements, television, and things like that sort of support this culture? Do any of you have any comments or thoughts related to that?
We conceptually, I didn't put the slide in here, but again, if you're talking about the whatever level of the socio-ecological model that you're talking about, whether individual, relational, community, or societal, it's not like the media is this freestanding entity. The media is controlled by individuals, and the same premise kind of applies. It's beginning to, when if I go back to the butterfly model here, it is we do our work on this end. We build a relationship with targeted, people influential in whatever domain that they're influential. For example, media, and we get them to buy in. We get the ownership. We get the competence, and then this right side here of the model is, it's silly to say once we've got you, once you're willing to go, okay, I want to become involved. I want to do my green dot, and we just have a generic answer. Okay, you go, you stuff envelopes, or you intervene at a party. Well, that's silly to say to someone that never goes to a party. And so instead, there's kind of this assessment on the other end of, what are your interests? What are your skills? What are your passions? You want people to stay engaged, have them do something that they're good at, they're interested in. What positions of authority do you hold? Who likes and respects you? In other words, what's your sphere of influence? And what resources can you access? And so these are a matter of getting individuals that are in each of those levels, whether it's media or government or policymakers or business, getting them bought in at very much the same process, and then having their green dot be something that can influence. And let me give a couple examples. We just had a meeting with a major technology company here in town, and met with their, up in Louisville actually, and met with their president and CEOs, and, had a conversation of what is went through the same process of creating buy-in, relationship building, things of that nature, and then beginning to discuss with them about what would a green dot company look like, what would the policies of a green dot company look like, what would the awareness, what kind of funding, and then being willing to step in using their influence, because again, the president of a company has a different kind of influence than a freshman. And by the time we left, not only was there a willingness to go, okay, we'll be your national prototype, we'll work with you on this, but literally by the time I got back to the office, one of the vice presidents had already contacted two of their contacts at two other major companies, Brown-Forman and another company, saying, hey, what could we do here? So it's the same dynamic, peers influencing peers, whether it's CEOs influencing CEOs. If I had done a cold call to Brown-Forman and said, hey, could we do this green dot? They'd, who are you, lady? But the fact that a peer of theirs called and said, hey, can we do this? The second thing is we had an event here in Kentucky about a year ago where to really address exactly what this question addressed, we pulled together 8 different groups. We pulled together folks from the media, folks from government, folks from higher education, folks from mental health, folks from medicine, folks from K through 12. I forget all of them, but and we asked that question: how does green dot translate? What do we want a legislator to be doing? How could they be impacting policy? And how do we break it down in a way that is manageable, that they would buy into? Same question for media, same question for businesses, etc. So the model that we use, the basic premise of the model stays the same. Everyone do your piece. And if you happen to be the president of a university, if you happen to be working at a TV studio, your dot's going to impact that level of the socio-ecological model.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. We have only about 5 minutes left, and so I apologize to the people whose questions I did not get to. So I think this will probably be the final question. The question is whether any of you have any suggestions about how to engage campuses that are reluctant to even admit that they have sexual assault. The example that the questioner gave was a public university with a population of 30,000 that only reports 1 sexual assault on their Clery Act reporting.
Well, I'll just, since we're 5 minutes left, I'll try to be a little bit provocative just to end on a hot note. This is one of my, I visit a lot of campuses around the country, and there's some places like University of Kentucky that we've just been hearing about some incredible programming that's been going on there, and there are a number of other campuses where there are really active sexual assault prevention work going on. But I have to say, and I say this as a member of the Academy, that as a whole, what we are doing a shameful job of dealing with sexual violence, and that there are the majority of our campuses are doing what we might call sort of as the minimum necessary to not be too shameful. But compared to what we could be doing, it really is shameful. And it's been enormously instructive to me to see the United States Air Force and the Army take on sexual assault. And I'm not going to argue that they did it for purely altruistic reasons. Their hands were forced by congressional pressure, and in the case of the Air Force, the scandal at the Academy. But I have witnessed firsthand the leadership of those institutions really take this on and commit their institutions and their cultures to really significant change. And it's and it's ongoing, and it continues. And I have yet to hear of really a single university where we do have campuses where there's a lot of excellent work being done, but I don't know that I've ever heard of a board of regents, the chancellor, the president, making this a visible top priority. And when you think about, and Chris, you can speak to this. We know from epidemiological work that this age range of 18 to 24 is the most vulnerable to this kind of violence. We have campuses that are, where there's just thousands of young men and women are living and arriving and spending formative years, and yet somehow we are not leading the nation. We're not doing everything we possibly can. And so I actually think that this is something I would like to see, sort of there's a political side to this that really needs to be addressed, which is, why is it that we're not doing the job that we can be doing?
Yeah, I think I've been very lucky in that I've worked with a number of universities who have a very different take on it, but there are certainly universities that practice what I've called before the cruise ship mentality. Cruise ships pretty much want you to come on board, and they want you to have a good time while you're there, and then they want you off their ship before any possible problem could arise. And if a problem arises, they do anything they can to make it seem like it's not a problem. And there's certainly universities and other types of institutions that practice that same model. And I have to believe things are getting better, but there remain to be campuses that aren't doing enough, and pressure will get exerted on those campuses over time, whether it be by victims advocates, parents of students, faculty members, actual students, and I think that can really make a difference. I mean, I'll say that a university around here that had a case not too long ago really received a ton of pressure from students about not doing enough to acknowledge the problem on campus, not doing enough to prevent it. And the administration, I firmly believe, felt enough pressure that it made them start to reach out to researchers and folks in the prevention world to say, what can we be doing and what can we be doing differently? And I think it's led to research on those campuses. So I think there's potential, and I think we've come some way, but there's a long way to go, especially in some places.
I really work through the lens of it doesn't matter what I'm saying if I don't say it in a way that they can hear it. And I firmly agree with, wholeheartedly with the comments of David and Chris. And on a real practical level, I say, it doesn't help me to go, this stinks, and why aren't they doing more? I have to go, how can I have to keep trying different ways of saying it until I get them to listen. So kind of the practical advice is keep switching it up. If they're not hearing you say it this way, what if they heard it from someone else? Who are the people that are closest to them that they respect? What if you got them on board and then got them to carry the message? It's just really switching up who are your best spokespeople, what are different ways you can say it. Is it emotion? Is it data? Is it money? Is it legal? Just keep spiraling through your options until you find a way that they can hear it.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I know I have learned a lot, so I hope everyone else out there has too. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jim for some final instructions.
Well, thank you, everybody, for just a great event. There were so many questions coming in, and I think this is one of the most successful we've had. Thank you to our panel and our moderator. If you just give me a few seconds, running a little behind on my web browsing here, I'm going to pop up a web screen for all of you, and that should allow you to access our text-based chat room without having to open up a browser window. You can get there right from here. I do apologize for the wait. My unfortunately, my computer seems to be running very slowly, I guess. So my network speed is currently everyone's network speed, since you're all waiting for me.
If you'd like, I could lead a sing-along to pass the time and keep people engaged. David, if you wouldn't mind starting.
All right, here we go. Okay, again, very sorry about that wait, but now we should have a web screen popping up. And what you're going to see is the service we're using is called Campfire Now. And you're going to have a screen in front of you that allows you to type in your display name. So you can type that in and then just click Sign In, and you'll be entered into our chat room. So those of you who have stuck around this long, perhaps you'll be willing to stick around a little bit longer and continue the discussion with other audience members. I'll be there to answer any technical questions, but as you'll see, it's very easy to use. And you can type in URL addresses, and they'll become hyperlinked if you want to share resources. And there is a 24-person limit, so if some of you are trying to enter within the next couple minutes and it says that the room is full, I would recommend that you stick around and just keep trying, because sometimes people will come in for a minute or two just to see what's going on and then leave to go off to a meeting. So if you really want to stick around and chat and it looks like you're getting locked out, just give it another minute or two. And thanks again to everybody for making this event such a success, and we'll see you in the chat room.
Great. Thank you so much.
Tim.
Bye.